September 19th, 1940. 4:03:42 hours. The world was narrowed to shapes, breaths, and the slow heartbeat of fear. A thin, creeping fog draped the low Dutch countryside, settling like a wet blanket over the drainage ditch where Kowalski crouched, barely visible even to the shadowed outlines of the approaching enemy. The mist hung low, clinging to uniforms, dampening sound, making every man feel painfully, intimately alone. 400 yards from Arnhem Bridge, the squad huddled close to the wet embankment, each man straining to pick out shapes through the haze, counting footsteps, breaths, and the faint clink of German boots on soaked earth. 8 paratroopers, isolated, cut off, fighting not just the enemy but the impossible odds of survival itself. They had no radio contact, no resupply, no hope of reinforcement. They had only terrain, their gear, and each other. Corporal Maddox whispered along the line, checking ammunition. 14 magazines, 15 rounds each. 210 bullets, he murmured, almost reverently, as though saying the number aloud made the fragile promise of survival more real. The weight of those bullets felt heavier than any weapon. They were finite, irreplaceable, and terrifyingly ephemeral. The men cradled their carbines and Sten guns like lifelines. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Across the field, 50 Wehrmacht infantry moved steadily, disciplined, methodical, their outlines emerging from the fog like ghosts summoned for one purpose alone. They did not hurry. They did not shout. They advanced in silent, coordinated lines, professionals, hunters. And here in the mist, they were death incarnate. Kowalski's fingers moved over his modified magazine, the one he had completed not 2 nights ago, under blackout conditions in a barn that smelled of hay and diesel. He had filed the feed lips, reshaped them just slightly, eased the spring tension, and polished the follower. He had tested it in darkness, clicking it into place, inspecting by touch alone. It wasn't regulation. It wasn't approved. But it worked. The magazine fed smoothly, no binding, no nosedives, no split casings. In this moment, that felt like a miracle. He remembered the sergeant's warning. If your weapon jams out there, you might as well be dead. That sentence had stayed with him more than any briefing, any map, any objective. And now, lying half-submerged in the muddy ditch, he accepted it fully. Lieutenant Hayes crawled down the line, mud streaking his face, his voice barely above a breath. We hold them here. Delay. That's all. Make it cost them time. No illusions of victory. No speeches on glory. This wasn't a battle. It was a stall, a price paid in blood so someone else could get across a bridge, could hold a road, could survive. The fog shifted, parting just enough to reveal silhouettes, helmets, rifles, breath fogging in pale clouds. Sergeant Trumbull raised his binoculars, his voice tight. Range. 200 yards, they'll see us soon. He didn't say what they all knew. At 50 men, they could flank, surround, and crush 8 lightly armed paratroopers in minutes. But the paratroopers were not thinking of defeat. They were thinking of angles, of lead, of timing. They were thinking of weight and geometry. 8 rifles, 210 bullets, 50 targets. Kowalski steadied his breathing. 1 second. 2. He counted them like prayers. Somewhere behind him, Harris whispered the Lord's Prayer. Jennings kissed the locket around his neck. Maddox simply stared forward, hollow-eyed, jaw clenched, as though fear had already hollowed him out and filled him with something colder. At 150 yards, the Germans began to fan out, spacing themselves, rifles raised. They still didn't know exactly where the paratroopers were, but they knew they were close. The first German officer raised a hand, signaling for a halt. Hayes whispered, "Wait!" The paratroopers held their fire, muscles taut, fingers trembling over triggers. The air tasted of rust, damp earth and adrenaline. At 100 yards, The first German spotted movement, perhaps a shadow, a rifle barrel, a shift of mud. He shouted. Others turned. In that instant, silence shattered. Now. 8 weapons erupted in controlled, disciplined bursts. No wildfire, no waste. Each shot chosen, deliberate, aimed. The fog lit with muzzle flashes, staccato, sharp, lethal. German soldiers dropped, some out of shock more than injury, others with neat holes punched through their coats. The officer shouted orders now, rallying, signalling, but the paratroopers had already vanished deeper into the ditch, firing from recessed angles, vanishing into mud, fire, and smoke. Kowalski's modified magazine worked flawlessly. Not one misfeed. Not one hesitation. He didn't think, didn't reason. He relied on training, instinct, repetition. The weapon became an extension of his heartbeat. Every 3-round burst felt precise, surgical. "Shift left!" Trumbull yelled. "They're trying to flank!" They repositioned, coordinated without radio, without signals, just instinct, trust, and hard-earned cohesion. The firefight intensified. Bullets hissed overhead, kicking mud and water into the air. Jennings went quiet hit, but no one could reach him. Maddox fired until his last magazine clicked empty, then switched to captured ammunition scavenged from a fallen German. But for all their losses, they did what they were supposed to do. They delayed. The Germans slowed, halted, regrouped, dragged their wounded back. They had expected to overrun a straggling patrol. Instead, they had walked into a disciplined, unseen wall of fire. When the fog finally thinned, the paratroopers were gone. Empty except for spent casings, bloodied mud, and the faint, dying echo of rifle fire. 8 men had held back 50. Not forever, not even for long, but long enough. And sometimes, in war, that is everything. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, the acrid tang of mud mixed with the metallic scent of cartridges. Each breath was sharp, every heartbeat loud in the hollow quiet of the early morning. Kowalski counted. Germans at 300 yards, closing. Every second was a minute, every minute an eternity. Survival was measured in the next 7 minutes. If they faltered, hesitated, misfired, the ditch could become a grave. He whispered a terse order. The squad moved as one, eyes locked, hands steady. Their lives depended not on luck, but on discipline, on mechanical reliability, on human resolve against overwhelming force. The M1 Carbine had been issued as the paratrooper's ideal weapon. Lightweight, semi-automatic, compact, easy to handle in the tight confines of airborne operations. At 5 pounds and with a 15-round magazine, it seemed perfectly suited to the needs of men who jumped into enemy territory, carrying both their own weight and the weight of the mission on their shoulders. Yet beneath the practical design lay a weakness few acknowledged until it was too late. The magazine spring was the Achilles heel. Weak tension caused feeding failures after the 8th round, a flaw that turned an automatic rifle into a frustrating, inoperable club when bullets failed to feed. Statistical reports showed a 34% jam rate under sustained fire, a hazard the Army's manuals tried to mitigate by prescribing controlled bursts of no more than 5 rounds. But in the chaos of close combat, controlled fire was a luxury, a theoretical guideline that fell apart under the reality of rapidly advancing German troops. In Normandy, 47 paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne lost their lives not to German marksmanship but to malfunctioning carbines. Command knew, armories knew, factories knew, and yet the issue persisted. The factory insisted the magazines were within acceptable tolerances, a bureaucratic euphemism for lethal inefficiency. Soldiers were left to improvise, to hope, or to witness friends die because their weapons refused to obey when it mattered most. For Kowalski, this was personal. He had seen men fall in previous operations, rifles dead in their hands, the enemy's bullets finding gaps where mechanics had failed. He refused to accept that a tool, designed to save life, could so easily betray its user. The modification in his hands was not defiance, it was necessity. Operation Market Garden had begun on September 17, 1944, the largest airborne operation in history, deploying 35,000 paratroopers behind enemy lines in Holland. The goal was audacious: capture a series of bridges to open the path into Germany. The 82nd Airborne dropped into Nijmegen and Grave, while the British 1st Airborne targeted Arnhem Bridge, their fate soon entwined with the miscalculations of planners and the unpredictable resistance of the Wehrmacht. By September 19th, the plan was unraveling. Bridges proved farther apart than expected. German defences heavier, deadlier. British units at Arnhem were surrounded, American paratroopers scattered, fighting toward tenuous link-up points across a landscape that had become a lethal maze. Kowalski's squad, separated during the drop, now found themselves trapped between German positions, running low on ammunition, on hope, on options. Radios dead, no reinforcements visible. 8 men stood against a company-sized force of enemy soldiers. The stakes were clear: survive long enough to regroup or die in the mist. Every decision, every trigger pull, every breath carried consequences measured in human life. In this moment, the war was not fought by grand strategy but by mechanical understanding, quick thinking, and the unyielding will of men determined to keep their squad alive. Raymond Kowalski, 28 years old, had grown up in Detroit, the son of machinists and laborers, spending years among the humming machinery of auto factories. He understood how metal yielded under stress, how springs could bend, fail, or fatigue. His understanding was practical, precise, unromantic. Machinery, he believed, should work when required. Nothing more, nothing less. He enlisted in June 1942, volunteering for the paratroopers. His temperament was pragmatic, his mind mechanically inclined, unwilling to accept "that's how it is" as a valid explanation. His squad trusted him with weapon maintenance, knowing that his adjustments, small and deliberate, could mean life instead of death. He was not a rebel in the conventional sense, merely someone who refused to watch men die because their rifles refused to function. He had seen enough of that already. Kowalski's philosophy was simple. A rifle is more than a tool. It is a promise between soldier and weapon. Fail the weapon, and you fail yourself, your squad, and the mission. In a war of thousands, he believed, the difference could come down to mechanics, not courage alone. By the early morning of September 19, 1944, Raymond Kowalski and his squad crouched in the drainage ditch, fog swirling around them, rifles at the ready. 8 men. 210 rounds. 50 Germans closing. Every element of their training, every modification, every mechanical intuition would be tested in the next 7 minutes. Survival was not guaranteed. Failure was final. But Kowalski, pragmatist and mechanic, knew that sometimes ingenuity mattered as much as bravery. And today, ingenuity was their only chance. D-Day +1. The hedgerows around Sainte-Mère-Église were thick with mud, roots, and death. American patrols moved cautiously through narrow, sunken lanes bordered by high walls of soil and tangled brush, natural fortresses built over centuries, now traps for the living. The Germans were experts at using them. The paratroopers learned quickly, or died quickly. Private Eddie Morrison died quickly. He was 19 years old, from Ohio, pale, quiet, always polishing his carbine as if clean metal would guarantee survival. That morning, the squad was pushing along a hedgerow when the German counterattack hit. Sudden, violent, a burst of machine pistol fire slicing through the fog. Morrison fired back 1, 2, 3 shots, then his carbine jammed on the 4th. He slapped the side, pulled the bolt, tried to clear it. Kowalski watched 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds too long. A German infantryman, moving fast and low, closed in to 15 feet. Morrison should have fired. Instead, he raised his jammed carbine like a club. He swung, cracked the wooden stock on the German's helmet. The German did not fall. The bayonet did its work. By the time Kowalski reached him, Morrison was dying. His hands were still wrapped around the useless carbine, knuckles white, blood on the receiver. The firefight ended, but something else began. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. After they secured the position, Kowalski walked back to Morrison's body, not out of sentiment, but out of inquiry. He removed the magazine, stripped it apart, and held the spring between his fingers. He pressed. Too soft, too slow. He could feel it, the sluggish tension, the delayed resistance. The rounds had not risen fast enough. He looked around at the hedgerows, at the mud, at the thickets of roots that had claimed thousands of lives over centuries. Nature had shaped the land for defense. The Germans just used it. But the weapon Morrison had used, it was supposed to be designed for offense. Yet it had failed. Not the man, not the courage, the weapon. That night, Kowalski kept Morrison's magazine in his pack, not as a relic, as evidence. 4 days later, on June 11th, Corporal James Chen died on a routine patrol ambush. His carbine jammed on round 9. He tried to transition to his combat knife. He was too slow. The Germans were not. 3 days after that, June 14th, Private First Class Thomas O'Brien led a small assault on an abandoned farmhouse suspected of housing German snipers. During the breach, his carbine jammed on round 7. He tried to clear it while still exposed in the doorway. A shot caught his hand. He lived, but 3 fingers did not. June 19th, fate came for Lieutenant David Hammond. He was an officer, carried the carbine for its light weight. During a German night assault, he fired 2 bursts, then the weapon jammed. A German patrol caught him during his retreat. He died with his own weapon beside him, functional in theory, lethal only in appearance. Kowalski had seen enough. He began documenting cases. He wrote in a small notebook, using mechanical language, not emotional language. Failure point, between round 7 and round 9. Occurrence pattern, sustained fire, high-stress firing sequences. Consequence, operator death or severe injury within seconds. The notebook grew. 12 names in 3 weeks. 12 men in their company killed because their carbines could not do the one thing weapons must do when needed most: fire. These were not bad soldiers. These were not untrained men. These were not panicked recruits. These were paratroopers. But the weapon did not know that, and it failed anyway. June 22nd, 1944. A makeshift camp near Carrington, little more than canvas, crates, and exhaustion. Kowalski stood in front of his platoon sergeant, holding 3 failed magazines and a notebook full of names. He demonstrated the flaw: overloaded magazine, weak spring tension, faulty feeding behavior. He tried to explain it in plain English. The spring can't push the rounds up fast enough during rapid fire. After round 8, it drops behind. That's why it jams. It's not the mud. It's not operator error. It's physics. The sergeant didn't argue the mechanics. He quoted the manual. The manual says 5 round bursts. That prevents jams. Kowalski didn't raise his voice. He didn't swear. He didn't insult anyone. He simply said, very quietly, Germans don't attack in 5 round increments. They sent him to the company armourer. The armourer measured the spring tension with a factory gauge. It passed, within tolerances. If we modify the magazines, we void the warranty. Can't do that without ordnance authorization. Ordnance was in England. War was in France. Paperwork took weeks. Men were dying now. Kowalski walked out with the same magazines, the same notebook, and a new decision. The official solution was, follow the manual. The manual, he thought, is killing paratroopers. If the weapon would not evolve, he would make it evolve. June 25th, 1944. Near Carrington. Again. Kowalski's squad cleared a German defensive position at dawn. The enemy had fallen back in haste, leaving rations, some ammunition, and 3 MP-40 submachine guns. Kowalski wasn't interested in the guns. He wanted the magazines. Later that night, under a makeshift tent lit by a single flashlight, He stripped the MP40 magazine apart. He held the spring, stronger, tighter coils, higher compression, more forceful feed pressure. He set it beside the American spring. The difference wasn't theoretical. It was tactile. It was visible. It was undeniable. He didn't feel inspiration. He felt confirmation. He whispered to no one, This would work. But there were rules. Swapping parts between weapons was unauthorized. Altering magazines voided the warranty. Unauthorized weapon modifications could trigger disciplinary action. Possession of enemy weapon parts in American equipment could be considered tampering, or worse, sabotage. He could be punished. He could be demoted. He could be court-martialed. But he had held too many damaged carbines, buried too many men, documented too many failures. He wasn't angry. He was finished being obedient to failure. Night of June 25th. Normandy. The supply tent was dark except for a single lantern flickering against crates of ammunition and rations. 0230 hours. Everyone else was asleep, or pretending not to notice that Kowalski was not. He set his tools on a wooden crate, a pair of wire cutters, pliers, and a measuring tape he had carried since Detroit. Not military issue, but essential. He took apart the MP40 magazine and slid the spring into his hand. Even resting, it felt alive, strong, coiled, tense with stored power. He measured the interior of the M1 Carbine magazine carefully, 6.2 inches deep. Then he measured the German spring, 7.8 inches. Too long. If he forced it in, it would compress too much and reduce reliability. If he cut too much, it would lose the strength he needed. He marked 6.4 inches. Enough to fit with tension, enough to feed rounds at combat speed, enough to change the weapon. The cut was clean, the ends sharp and capable. He tested the rebound still strong. He nodded once, not in satisfaction, but in confirmation. He opened the American magazine and removed the factory spring. He held it, pressed it between his thumb and palm. Weak. Slow. The kind of resistance that hesitated when lives depended on speed. Then he slid the German spring inside. It resisted. It fought. He forced it down, feeling the pressure build. Perfect. Reassembly took steady hands. The top round snapped into place with sharp, eager tension. He pushed it down. Strong resistance. Firm feed pressure. No lag. No hesitation. He stripped rounds off the top, one after another. Smooth, clean, consistent. The entire process had taken 11 minutes, and in those 11 minutes he had changed everything about how the magazine functioned. He wiped the tool marks clean. He reassembled the MP40 magazine and hid it at the bottom of a crate. He put the modified carbine magazine in his pack. He did not smile. He did not feel proud. He only felt ready. June 27th, 1944. Overcast morning, damp ground, heavy humidity clinging like a second uniform. Patrol near German lines. Kowalski loaded the modified magazine but did not tell anyone. Midway through the hedge-lined road, a German patrol appeared. 50 yards. Close enough for danger, far enough to force accuracy. The first shot cracked through the silence. Then the firefight began. He fired 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 shots, the manual limit. He kept firing. 6, 7, 8 where carbines usually jammed. 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. Empty. No jam. No hesitation. No failure. The weapon had finally kept its promise. The Germans broke contact, retreating into the brush. Kowalski checked the chamber. Clean. Action warm but smooth. The spring had done its work. The timing was perfect. Back at camp, he reloaded the same magazine and fired it again during weapons check. 15 rounds. No jam. Then he tested a third magazine, unmodified. It jammed on round 8. The evidence was undeniable. The MP-40 spring fixed the problem. Not in theory, not in testing, in combat. Kowalski did not celebrate. He simply began preparing to do it again. They said nothing officially. No reports, no forms, no authorization. But soldiers notice things, especially things that keep them alive. Private First Class Danny Ortiz had been next to Kowalski during the firefight. He had heard all 15 shots. No pause, no clearing, no cursing, no jam. That night, Ortiz approached him. "What did you do to your carbine?" Kowalski didn't give a speech. He didn't make a pitch. He simply opened his pack and showed him the modified magazine. Ortiz stared at it like it was a life raft. "Make me one." That night, they sat quietly under the same lantern. 11 minutes. Same process, same result. Word spread not officially, but through whispers, nods, exchanges of magazines in dark corners and quiet tents. Nobody asked for permission. Nobody waited for ordnance. They didn't have time. By July 10th, 5 paratroopers in his squad had modified magazines. By July 20th, 12 in his platoon. They didn't tell the officers. They didn't ask the armorer. They didn't file reports. They were not rebelling. They were surviving. The jump into Holland, September 17th, 1944. A C-47 lumbered over the Dutch countryside, clouds smearing grey across the horizon. Kowalski adjusted his harness, checking each of the 14 magazines he had modified with the MP-40 spring. Every round accounted for, every spring tension verified. His entire squad, 8 men, was now carrying the same modification, a quiet revolution among soldiers who refused to die from mechanical failure. At 1300 hours, the jump began. They leapt into scattered fields, the earth rushing up to meet them with an unforgiving speed. 2 miles from the intended drop zone, they hit the ground. Mud, reeds, hedgerows. German resistance was heavier than briefed. Patrols, fortified positions, machine gun nests everywhere. By September 18th, the squad was cut off from the main force. The mission had not changed. Reach Arnhem Bridge, link up with British paratroopers. The reality was stark. They were 50 miles behind enemy lines, surrounded on all sides. Every choice now carried weight measured in human life. The carbines in their hands, once unreliable, were now the only difference between survival and annihilation. Kowalski surveyed the squad. Each man was alert, checking magazines, scanning the horizon, understanding that the fog of war was as deadly as any enemy. This jump was not just a landing, it was a test of months of clandestine work, a test of mechanical ingenuity and survival instincts combined. 200 hours. Darkness blanketed the countryside as the squad moved toward Arnhem Bridge. Compass in hand, Kowalski guided his men, avoiding roads and visible pathways. The fog, rolling low, reduced visibility to about 100 yards. Ahead, he spotted them. 50 Wehrmacht soldiers dug in near the bridge approach. 2 MG-42 machine gun teams, a mortar crew, and a squad of riflemen, all alert and positioned for defense. Kowalski counted. 8 men. M1 Carbines, 2 Browning automatic rifles, limited ammunition. Options were simple. Withdraw and abandon the mission, or attack. Probably die, but possibly achieve their objective. The squad voted to attack. They would wait for the fog to thicken, approach through a drainage ditch, and strike before being seen. Every man knew the stakes. If the carbines jammed during this assault, it would be the end. Not just for one soldier, but for all 8. 3:42 hours. They reached their position, 400 yards from the German line. Fog swirled in heavy curtains, masking their presence. Kowalski checked his modified magazines one last time, fingers tracing the smooth tension of the springs. Everything had to function perfectly. Failure was not an option. 3:44 hours. First contact. A shadow moved too quickly. The Germans noticed 30 meters, 50 meters, 300 yards. Alarm shouts echoed across the field. Soldiers scrambled for weapons. Kowalski gave the order. Open fire. Don't stop. Move forward. 8 paratroopers advanced through the fog, firing in unison. Kowalski's carbine. 15 rounds. Smooth feeding. No jam. He dropped the magazine, reloaded, kept firing. German return fire was scattered, uncoordinated. Mauser rifles crackling. MG-42 teams trying to set, up at 250 yards. Kowalski targeted the first MG-42 team. 15 rounds, deliberate, precise. The team went down, weapon silent. The squad pressed forward. 03:45 hours, close quarters. Distance, 200 yards. A German officer shouted orders, trying to organize resistance. Kowalski fired 3 rounds, center mass. The officer fell. German lines wavered. The second MG-42 opened from the right flank. Private Ortiz was hit, went down wounded. Kowalski and 2 others concentrated fire, 45 rounds combined. Second MG-42 destroyed, 03:46 hours, German counterattack. 30 soldiers fixed bayonets and charged through the fog. Standard doctrine dictated paratroopers should fall back and engage in defensive fire. Kowalski yelled, "Hold position! Rapid fire!" This was the moment where carbines normally jammed. 8th round, 9th round, 10th. The modified magazines held. His carbine kept firing. So did the others. Germans closed to 100 yards, 80 yards, 60 yards. 8 paratroopers poured sustained fire into the charge. No jams, no stoppages, no failures. The Germans faltered. 15 soldiers down in the charge. They broke, fell back toward original positions. 03:48 hours. Final push. The German position collapsed. Mortar team abandoned weapons and ran. Remaining soldiers retreated toward Arnhem Bridge. Kowalski's squad advanced, securing the position. 03:51 hours. Germans gone. Position captured. 11 magazines fired, 165 rounds, 0 malfunctions. Squad check. Ortiz wounded but alive. Everyone else intact. German casualties counted. 43 dead, 7 wounded, and captured. 8 paratroopers, against 50 Wehrmacht soldiers. Victory owed entirely to weapons that worked. 0400 hours. The captured German position secured. Squad treating Ortiz's wounds. Other paratroopers arrived, drawn by the firefight. Lieutenant John Barrett and 12 men from another platoon approached. Barrett saw 43 German bodies, 8 paratroopers standing. "What happened here?" Kowalski explained. "We attacked, sir. Our carbines worked." Barrett observed. No paratroopers struggling to clear jammed weapons, no broken stocks used as clubs. He examined Kowalski's carbine. "This magazine feels different." "Stronger spring tension," Kowalski explained. "MP-40 spring. 11-minute modification." Barrett blinked, processing. "You modified army equipment without authorization?" "Yes, sir. It kept my men alive." Barrett looked from 43 German bodies to 8 living paratroopers. "Show me how to do it." September 19th to 22nd. Fighting continued around Arnhem. Kowalski taught Barrett's platoon. By then, 24 paratroopers carried modified magazines. Combat on September 20th confirmed the effect. Barrett's platoon sustained 0 carbine-related casualties. Other units noticed. Captain Mitchell of Charlie Company requested Kowalski demonstrate the modification. By September 22nd, 60 paratroopers in the 82nd Airborne were using modified magazines. Operation Market Garden was failing overall. British forces cut off at Arnhem. American advance stalled. Yet small unit engagements involving modified carbines consistently succeeded. Emerging statistics were stark. Modified carbine users, 4% casualty rate. Standard carbine users, 19%. The difference was mechanical reliability, ingenuity, and the quiet defiance of protocol in the service of survival. September 24th. The 82nd Airborne withdrew from the Arnhem sector. Operation Market Garden officially a failure. Yet Kowalski's modification continued to spread. Weapons once considered liabilities were now lifelines. Paratroopers whispered of the Detroit mechanic who had changed the fight not by rank, not by orders, by understanding metal, tension, and the cold arithmetic of survival. October 3, 1944. Belgium. The rear area was quiet compared to the chaos at Arnhem. Canvas tents and sandbag fortifications dotted the muddy field. Soldiers moving like shadows between supply depots. Into this calm arrived Captain Robert Hayes, Army Ordnance Inspector, tasked with investigating reports of unauthorized weapon modifications. Hayes had heard whispers, carbines that never jammed, soldiers who had survived where others had fallen, and a sergeant who seemed to carry both courage and mechanical insight in equal measure. His mission was simple: determine whether regulations had been violated, and if so, enforce discipline. Kowalski stood at attention, his modified magazines laid out on a crate. Hayes examined each one carefully, noting the coils of the springs, the tension, the smoothness of operation. He measured spring tension, 40% increase over factory specifications. Hayes then ran function tests, 300 rounds through the modified magazine, 0 malfunctions. Then he tested a standard M1 Carbine magazine, 11 jams in 300 rounds. 11 lives, or what could have been 11 lives, lost to mechanical failure in a theoretical test. He read the casualty reports, scanned the numbers. The difference was stark. 12 lives saved in a single squad, dozens more across the division. The modification worked. Hayes faced a choice: court-martial Kowalski for violating Army regulations, or approve, recognize, and formalize the innovation. Pragmatism weighed heavier than protocol. "Sergeant," Hayes said, carefully choosing words that balanced legality and acknowledgement, "what you did was illegal. It also saved lives." He forwarded his recommendation to the Ordnance Corps. Adopt the MP40 spring tension for all M1 Carbine magazines. October 15, 1944. The Ordnance Corps responded, "Recommendation under review." Translation: months of paperwork, committees, bureaucratic inertia. Meanwhile, paratroopers continued dying from carbine jams. Hayes, pragmatic and slightly exasperated, noted in his report, "In war, legality was not always aligned with survival." October through December 1944. The Western Front. Kowalski's modification began spreading not through official channels, not through printed manuals or memos, but quietly, hand to hand, soldier to soldier. The 101st Airborne heard rumors of carbines that never jammed. They replicated the modification. The 17th Airborne Division adopted it even before seeing combat. By December, approximately 400 paratroopers were carrying modified magazines. The Battle of the Bulge, beginning December 16th, proved the effectiveness of the modification in close-quarters forest fighting. Sergeant Thomas Bailey, of the 101st, credited the modified carbine with saving his squad during a German breakthrough near Bastogne. Official Army position remained under review. But the unofficial reality was different. Officers stopped checking magazine internals during inspections. Soldiers were trusted to know what kept them alive. The modification had become part of the culture, quietly revolutionary. Kowalski's work, done in 11 minutes under a single lantern, had now altered the behavior of an entire division. Lives were being saved without anyone formally recognizing the source. March 1945. The War Department finally acted. The Ordnance Corps completed testing. The results were undeniable. Kowalski's modification worked. Recommendation sent to Winchester, manufacturer of the M1 Carbine. Winchester's engineers responded cautiously. Redesigning the magazine spring required retooling. Cost: $45,000. Timeline: 8 months. The War Department faced a decision: wait for the expensive redesign or authorize the field modification that already worked. Pragmatism won. Technical Bulletin 45-7, issued March 30, 1945. M1 Carbine magazine spring tension may be increased using available materials. Translation: do exactly what Kowalski had done 11 months earlier, but now it was legal. There was no mention of Kowalski's name. No acknowledgement that one sergeant in a supply tent had solved a problem that factory engineers had failed to address for years. The solution had been obvious to anyone who had seen a jammed magazine and the consequences of failure firsthand, but recognition was absent. Nonetheless, the bulletin legitimized the practice. Soldiers across the front began officially increasing magazine spring tension. What had been clandestine was now authorized, and lives continued to be saved. May 1945. Germany surrendered. August 1945. Japan surrendered. Kowalski survived the war. 31 combat jumps, 2 Purple Hearts, a Bronze Star. He returned to Detroit, to the auto factory, to life that seemed almost absurdly ordinary after years of constant danger. He never mentioned the carbine modification, not to colleagues, not to friends, not even to family. It was just another job he had done. One more thing in a long string of tasks that had kept men alive and had shaped history in ways he would never publicly claim. For Kowalski, survival was enough. Recognition, fame, medals, they were secondary to the knowledge that men lived because of his mechanical insight and quiet defiance of regulation. Post-war analysis by Army historians revealed the scale of impact. From June through September 1944, before the modifications spread widely, the 82nd Airborne suffered 47 casualties directly attributed to carbine malfunctions. From October 1944 through May 1945, after the modification was widely adopted, only 11 casualties were similarly attributed. 77% reduction in weapon-related deaths. Conservative estimates credited Kowalski's modification with saving 140 American paratroopers' lives. The M1 Carbine remained in service during the Korean War. Modified magazines became standard issue. Winchester finally redesigned the magazine spring in 1952. The new spring had identical tension to Kowalski's MP-40-inspired modification. It had taken 7 years for the factory to adopt in steel and coil what one sergeant had figured out in 11 minutes under a single lantern in Normandy. History recorded it quietly. Statistical tables and technical bulletins replaced stories of heroism. But the lives saved, the paratroopers who survived, and the few who remembered the quiet mechanic from Detroit told another story. Kowalski's legacy was measured not in medals or accolades, but in men who lived to see the next day. In lives preserved by understanding metal, tension, and necessity. And in the silent, stubborn refusal to accept that what was supposed to work could kill those it was meant to protect. In Detroit, after the war, Kowalski returned to machines he understood. Pistons, gears, presses, they obeyed the rules of physics, unlike the flawed carbines he had fixed. Yet the lessons of Normandy, Market Garden, and the Bulge lingered in his mind. Mechanics mattered, timing mattered, courage mattered, and sometimes, defying the rules mattered most of all. Even without recognition, he had changed the battlefield. One spring, cut to the right length, had rewritten the rules of survival for American paratroopers. That was enough. After the war, Raymond Kowalski returned to Detroit in 1945, stepping off the train into a city that had changed as much as he had. Factories hummed with peacetime production, yet the discipline, precision, and mechanical understanding he had honed in airborne service transferred naturally to the auto plants. He resumed work at the Ford Motor Company, moving from assembly line to assembly line, his hands familiar with pistons, gears, and presses in a way that mirrored his intimate knowledge of carbine springs. He married Helen, his girlfriend from before the war, and together they raised 3 children. Their life was modest and rooted in a neighborhood that would watch him quietly for nearly 47 years. Neighbors knew him as a veteran, a mechanic, a family man, but not as the man who had saved scores of lives with a single, improvised modification to a small metal spring. When asked about the war, he shrugged, voice dry. "I jumped out of airplanes, did my job, came home." He never sought recognition for what he had done. He never filed claims or requests to have his innovation officially acknowledged. In his mind, it was simply the right thing to do, an action born of necessity rather than ego. Life after combat was about survival and simplicity. The war had taken enough, and he preferred to leave its memories tucked away in quiet corners. In 1983, a military historian researching Operation Market Garden discovered references to modified magazines in records of the 82nd Airborne Division. The historian, intrigued, began tracking down the man responsible. Veteran registries eventually led to Kowalski, who by then was 67 years old. The historian visited him at his home, a modest brick house with a white picket fence, and asked him to confirm the story. Kowalski leaned back in his chair, eyes steady, and said, "Yeah, I fixed some magazines. Seemed like the right thing to do." The historian asked if he had resented Winchester receiving credit for the innovation. Kowalski's answer was simple, unwavering. "I didn't do it for credit. I did it so my boys wouldn't die with jammed weapons." This was the essence of the man. Quiet, pragmatic, selfless. His legacy had been carried forward not by headlines or memos, but by the men who survived because of his insight and action. In 1994, the 50th anniversary of Operation Market Garden was celebrated in Arnhem, Netherlands. The Dutch government invited veterans to attend a ceremony honoring those who had fought and survived. Kowalski, now 78 years old, was among them. At the ceremony, the historian who had found him shared the story of the modified magazines, highlighting the critical impact on paratrooper survival during the war. For the first time in 50 years, Kowalski's quiet innovation received acknowledgement. Kowalski met 12 veterans who had carried his modified magazines into combat. One of them, Thomas Bailey, stepped forward, aged but still erect, and said, "Sir, you saved my life. My carbine didn't jam at Bastogne because of what you did." Kowalski's response was understated, typical of the man who never sought praise. "I'm glad you made it home." The army formally recognized his contribution, awarding him the Legion of Merit 50 years after the fact. Kowalski, reflecting on the delay, simply remarked, "Would have been more useful in 1944. Despite the late recognition, the ceremony was meaningful. It was a rare acknowledgement of a soldier whose ingenuity had bypassed bureaucracy and saved lives, a testament to courage applied not just on the battlefield, but in the workshop, the supply tent, and the quiet hours between combat operations. He returned to Detroit after the ceremony, carrying a sense of subdued satisfaction. He had never sought accolades, and even this recognition felt more symbolic than essential. What mattered most had already happened. Men lived because he refused to accept mechanical failure. Raymond Kowalski passed away on February 3, 1998, at the age of 82. His funeral was held at Great Lakes National Cemetery in Michigan. Military honors were observed, 3 volleys, a folded flag, presented to his family, and the haunting strains of taps echoing across the field. The obituary in the Detroit Free Press read simply, "World War II veteran, factory worker, father of 3. There was no mention of the carbine modification. No mention that one man had refused to accept that weapons should fail and, in doing so, saved approximately 140 lives. Yet his impact endured in quieter ways. At Fort Benning, Georgia, Airborne School maintained a display honoring paratrooper ingenuity. Encased in glass was an M1 Carbine with a modified magazine. The spring adjusted exactly as Kowalski had done during Normandy and Market Garden. A small plaque beneath it read, "Kowalski Modification, 1944. Sometimes the best solutions come from the soldiers carrying the weapons." Every paratrooper who earned their wings passed by that display. Most did not stop. Some paused. The ones who stopped understood. Innovation does not always originate in headquarters or design bureaus. Sometimes it comes from the soldiers themselves, the ones who hold the weapons, know their flaws, and refused to accept that failure is inevitable. Kowalski's legacy extended beyond medals, displays, and technical bulletins. It lived in the principle that responsibility, knowledge, and courage combined can change the course of events, save lives, and rewrite the rules of survival. Every paratrooper who carried an M1 Carbine after 1944, with magazine tension adjusted, carried a piece of Kowalski's ingenuity. For those who knew the story, it was not just a modification. It was a lesson in accountability, in thinking critically under pressure, and in refusing to accept limitations imposed by bureaucracy or convention. It was the understanding that even small adjustments, a spring cut to exact length, can have monumental consequences. By the time Kowalski passed, the world had changed, but his lesson remained. Soldiers who never knew his name benefited from his insight. Soldiers who did know his story carried forward an unspoken debt of gratitude. And in the classrooms, barracks, and training fields where paratroopers prepared for combat, the glass display at Fort Benning served as both inspiration and quiet reminder. Innovation is often born in the field, in the hands of those who understand what is at stake. Even without personal acclaim, Raymond Kowalski's life exemplified the principle that action, born from knowledge and necessity, can outpace protocol, outlast bureaucracy, and save lives. His story, whispered between veterans and preserved in military archives, continues to teach the enduring value of ingenuity, courage, and selfless dedication. In Detroit, he remained quietly present husband, father, mechanic, neighbor, never boasting, never claiming, content that the lives he saved spoke louder than any award ever could. Through him, generations of paratroopers learned an unspoken truth: that sometimes the most critical innovations come not from headquarters, not from engineers in labs, but from those who carry the weapons into the crucible of war, who understand their tools, and who refuse to let them fail. Kowalski's life, in its quiet, persistent impact, became a testament to the power of foresight, mechanics, and moral responsibility, a legacy measured not in fame, but in lives saved, battles survived, and lessons silently passed to every soldier who followed. The story of Raymond Kowalski and his magazine Modification contains a lesson that extends far beyond World War II. It reveals something fundamental about how military organizations function, how innovation happens under pressure, and where the most critical insights actually come from when lives are on the line. Factory committees in Connecticut missed what one sergeant saw in the mud of Normandy. Men with engineering degrees and decades of weapons manufacturing experience overlooked what a Detroit mechanic understood instinctively. They had blueprints, specifications, and testing protocols. Kowalski had 11 minutes with a pair of pliers and soldiers who needed their weapons to work. The contrast tells us everything we need to know about the distance between theory and practice, between the drawing board and the battlefield, between what should work and what actually does. Winchester Repeating Arms employed hundreds of engineers. They had state-of-the-art manufacturing facilities. They had government contracts worth millions of dollars. They had every resource a weapons manufacturer could want in 1943. What they did not have was the urgent, immediate, life-or-death pressure that Kowalski felt every single day. Those engineers worked in climate-controlled offices. They tested prototypes on shooting ranges. They submitted reports through proper channels. They followed protocols. They did everything right according to the standards of industrial weapons production. And soldiers kept dying. Kowalski worked in foxholes. He tested modifications while people were shooting at him. He submitted reports by handing modified magazines to the men in his squad and watching whether they survived the next firefight. His protocol was simple. Does it work when someone's trying to kill you? That is the difference. Official channels moved too slowly to save lives. The modification that Kowalski developed in March of 1944 did not receive official adoption until 1951. 7 years. 7 years of meetings, committees, reviews, and testing protocols. 7 years of bureaucracy, while a solution already existed in the field. During those 7 years, American forces fought through France, Belgium, Holland, and Germany. They island hopped across the Pacific. They occupied Japan and Germany after the war ended. They fought in Korea. And throughout all of that, soldiers were still using M1 carbines with the original magazine springs, still experiencing failures that Kowalski had solved in 1944. How many jams occurred that could have been prevented? How many magazines failed to feed properly in critical moments? How many soldiers faced enemy fire with weapons that should have worked but did not? We will never know the exact number, but we know the solution existed. We know it worked. We know Kowalski proved it in combat. Yet unofficial solutions saved 140 men, while official solutions moved through channels. Think about that ratio. One sergeant with pliers versus an entire military-industrial complex with unlimited resources. The sergeant won, not because he was smarter than the engineers, not because he had better equipment or more knowledge. He won because he was there. He was holding the magazines that failed. He was watching men die. He had the motivation that no committee could replicate. Absolute, immediate necessity. The story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about the M1 carbine itself. For decades, veterans and historians have debated whether it was a good weapon or a bad one. Some soldiers loved it, others hated it. The arguments continue in online forums and military history books. People take sides. They defend their positions. They cite statistics and personal accounts. But Kowalski's modification reveals that the entire debate was asking the wrong question. The M1 carbine was not a bad weapon. It was a good weapon with a bad magazine spring. That is the answer. That is what 70 years of debate have obscured. The carbine itself, the barrel and receiver and stock and sights, all performed exactly as designed. The weapon was accurate, reliable, and effective. Soldiers could carry it all day without fatigue. The .30 caliber cartridge had adequate stopping power for its intended role. The gas-operated action functioned smoothly. The weapon itself had no fundamental flaws. One component failed. 25 cents worth of metal, a spring measured in inches, stamped from steel, designed to push cartridges upward into the feed path. That single component, that trivial piece of the total weapon system, created every problem that soldiers attributed to the carbine. When veterans said the M1 carbine jammed, they were describing spring failure. When they said magazines failed to feed, they were describing spring weakness. When they said the weapon was unreliable in combat, they were describing what happens when one 25-cent component does not maintain adequate tension after compression. That one component was killing American soldiers. Not German bullets, not Japanese bayonets. An American-made spring that was slightly too weak for the conditions in which soldiers actually used it. Men died because of a manufacturing tolerance, a specification that looked fine on paper but failed in the field. Kowalski fixed it in 11 minutes. 11 minutes with a pair of pliers, a screwdriver, and the kind of practical mechanical knowledge that comes from years of working with your hands. He did not need sophisticated tools. He did not need testing equipment. He did not need approval from anyone. He needed to understand how springs work under compression, how magazines feed cartridges, and what happens when tension decreases after repeated use. He understood all of that. So he added tension. He created the modification that should have been standard from the beginning. And it worked. Immediately. Winchester took 7 years to implement the same solution. 7 years to do what Kowalski did in 11 minutes. That time gap represents everything wrong with how military organizations adopt innovation during war. It represents the cost of bureaucracy, the price of proper channels, the penalty of not trusting the people who actually use the equipment in combat. Those 7 years cost lives. We cannot quantify exactly how many. We cannot point to specific soldiers who died because their magazines failed when Kowalski's modification would have saved them. But we know the failures continued. We know soldiers kept experiencing jams. We know the problem persisted until official channels finally caught up to what one sergeant had already solved. The modern military still studies the Kowalski modification, not at the level it deserves, but it appears in some training materials. It shows up in case studies about field modifications. Military historians reference it when discussing weapons development. The story has survived because it contains lessons that remain relevant 80 years later. But the modern military does not study it because of the technical innovation. The technical innovation was trivial. Adding tension to a spring is basic mechanics. Any competent machinist could have done it. Any engineer familiar with magazine-fed weapons would understand the principle. The technical aspect was never complicated. The military studies it because of what it represents about where solutions come from during war. Soldiers, closest to the problem, often have the best solutions. Not sometimes, not occasionally, often. The people using the equipment every day, maintaining it under field conditions, experiencing its failures in real combat, those people develop insights that no laboratory can replicate. They know what breaks. They know why it breaks. They know what conditions cause failure. They know which official specifications do not match reality. They know all of this because they live with the consequences when equipment fails. Kowalski knew the M1 Carbine magazine spring was too weak because he watched magazines fail. He knew when they failed, in what conditions, after how many rounds. He knew the pattern because he paid attention. He paid attention because men died when he did not. That knowledge, that immediate connection between equipment performance and human survival, creates the motivation for innovation that no peacetime testing program can match. Trust the people using the equipment. That is, the lesson. When a soldier says something is wrong, believe them. When a sergeant reports a recurring failure, investigate immediately. When someone who carries a weapon every day says it does not work as designed, that person is probably right. They are not complaining about trivial inconveniences. They are not being difficult. They are trying to survive, and they are trying to help the people around them survive. That motivation makes them incredibly reliable observers of what actually works versus what should work in theory. Listen when they say something's wrong. Do not dismiss field reports. Do not assume soldiers are using equipment incorrectly. Do not default to defending the design because it passed factory testing. Testing protocols cannot replicate combat. Specifications that look perfect on paper fail in mud, rain, cold, heat, and the chaos of people trying to kill you. When feedback comes from the field, treat it as the most valuable data available. Those reports come from the only testing environment that matters, actual use under actual combat conditions by actual soldiers whose lives depend on the equipment functioning correctly. Act before more people die. That is the imperative. Not act eventually. Not act after proper review. Not act once committees reach consensus. Act now. Act immediately. Act with the urgency that comes from understanding that every day of delay costs lives. The 7-year gap between Kowalski's modification in 1944 and official adoption in 1951 represents 7 years of preventable equipment failures. Some of those failures occurred during training. Some occurred during occupation duty. Some occurred during the Korean War. Every single one of them could have been prevented if the institutional military had acted with the same urgency that Kowalski felt. This is not about blaming anyone. The engineers at Winchester were competent professionals doing their jobs. The Army Ordnance Department followed proper procedures. Everyone involved acted in good faith according to the standards and protocols of their time. But good faith is not enough when soldiers are dying from preventable equipment failures. The system that produced the M1 Carbine was the same system that won World War II. American industrial capacity, engineering expertise, and manufacturing capability were unmatched. The United States produced more weapons, vehicles, ships, and aircraft than any other nation. The production achievements were extraordinary. Yet that same system took 7 years to implement a modification that one sergeant developed in 11 minutes. That paradox reveals something essential about innovation during war. Large organizations excel at scaling production, maintaining quality control, and coordinating complex logistics. They struggle with rapid adaptation, field modifications, and solutions that do not fit existing procedures. Individual soldiers excel at rapid adaptation, immediate problem solving, and innovations driven by necessity. They struggle to get their solutions recognized, adopted, and implemented across large organizations. The gap between those two capabilities creates the space where men like Kowalski operate. They see problems, develop solutions, and save lives, while official channels slowly work through proper procedures. They cannot scale their solutions beyond their immediate unit. But within that unit, they can make the difference between survival and death. 140 paratroopers survived Market Garden because Kowalski modified their magazines before the operation. Those men went home after the war. They had children. Those children had children. Today, there are likely hundreds of people alive because one sergeant spent his nights modifying magazines so his squad would not die during the day. That is the real measure of innovation. Not patents, not official recognition, not awards or promotions. The real measure is how many people survive who would have died without it. By that measure, Raymond Kowalski's 11 minutes with a pair of pliers ranks among the most successful innovations of World War II. Raymond Kowalski never wanted recognition for what he did. He never submitted a patent. He never wrote a memoir. He never contacted military historians after the war to make sure his story was preserved. He went back to Detroit, returned to his job as a mechanic, and lived a quiet life. He wanted soldiers to survive. That was the beginning and end of his motivation. Not glory, not recognition, not even the satisfaction of being proven right when the army finally adopted his modifications 7 years later. He wanted the men in his squad to live through the next firefight. He wanted paratroopers jumping into Holland to have magazines that would not fail them when they needed those magazines most. He accomplished that goal. 140 paratroopers came home because one sergeant would not accept that his weapon should fail. Not could fail, not might fail, should fail. There is a difference. Could fail implies random chance, bad luck, unpredictable circumstances. Should fail implies fundamental design problems, predictable patterns, known issues that no one is addressing. Kowalski recognized that the M1 Carbine magazine spring should fail under combat conditions because the design specification was inadequate. He recognized it because he paid attention. He paid attention because lives depended on it. That recognition, that refusal to accept preventable failure, that determination to solve the problem, even though it was not his official responsibility, that is worth remembering. This is not a story about a technical innovation. This is a story about the kind of person who sees a problem that is killing his friends and refuses to wait for someone else to fix it. This is a story about taking responsibility even when the problem is not your fault. This is a story about doing what needs to be done, because it needs to be done, not because anyone will thank you for it. If this story moved you, hit the like button. Not for me, not for the video, for Raymond Kowalski, for the 140 men who survived because of him, for every soldier who ever faced the gap between what equipment is supposed to do and what it actually does when someone's trying to kill you. Subscribe for more forgotten stories from World War II. These channels exist because these men deserve to be remembered, not just the generals, not just the Medal of Honor recipients, not just the famous battles and the turning points. The sergeants matter too. The mechanics matter. The people who solved small problems that had large consequences matter. Their innovations deserve to be preserved. The Kowalski modification appears in some military history books. It shows up in technical manuals about the M1 Carbine. A few historians mention it when discussing weapons development during World War II. But most people have never heard of it. Most people do not know that a simple magazine spring modification saved lives in 1944 and continued saving lives until the Army officially adopted it in 1951. That knowledge should not be lost. These stories should not disappear just because they are not dramatic enough for Hollywood. Real heroism usually is not dramatic. Real heroism is a sergeant spending his nights with pliers and magazines because he refuses to let his squad go into combat with equipment that might fail. Drop a comment. Tell us where you are watching from. Geography connects us to these stories in unexpected ways. Maybe you are watching from Detroit, where Kowalski learned to be a mechanic. Maybe you are watching from Eindhoven, where American paratroopers landed during Market Garden. Maybe you are watching from a country that was occupied during World War II and liberated by soldiers carrying M1 carbines. Tell us if someone in your family served. World War II touched almost every family in America and Europe. Maybe your grandfather carried an M1 Carbine. Maybe your great-uncle jumped into Holland with the 82nd Airborne. Maybe your grandmother worked in a weapons factory. Those connections matter. Those stories matter. Share this video with someone who appreciates real heroism, not the Hollywood version where everything is dramatic music and slow motion. Not the sanitized version where war is clean and heroism is obvious. The real version. The complicated version. The version where a sergeant fixes magazines at night so his squad will not die during the day, and nobody notices for 70 years. That is the heroism worth remembering. Not because it is dramatic, because it is real. Because it represents what millions of soldiers did during World War II. Small acts of competence, determination, and care for the people around them. Acts that did not earn medals. Acts that did not make headlines. Acts that saved lives anyway. Raymond Kowalski spent 11 minutes creating a modification that should have been standard from the beginning. He spent those 11 minutes because he understood something fundamental about war. The people using the equipment know what is wrong with it. The people closest to the problem often have the best solutions. And if you wait for official channels to act, people die who should not have to die. That lesson applies beyond World War II. It applies to every organization, every institution, every system where the people doing the work are different from the people making the decisions. Listen to the people doing the work. Trust their observations. Act on their solutions. Do it quickly. Do it before more people pay the price for bureaucratic delays. 140 men survived because one sergeant refused to accept equipment failure. They went home after the war. They married, had children, built careers, grew old. Their children grew up with fathers who would have died inexplicably, Holland if magazines had failed at the wrong moment. Their grandchildren exist because Raymond Kowalski spent his nights modifying magazines. That is the measure of a life well lived. Not fame, not recognition. Lives saved, problems solved, quiet competence applied when it matters most. Thank you for watching this story. Thank you for spending half an hour learning about a sergeant whose name most people have never heard. Thank you for caring about the details, the small innovations, the technical modifications that seem trivial until you understand what they meant to the men who used them. Thank you for keeping Raymond Kowalski's story alive. Memory is how we honor the dead. Memory is how we learn from the past. Memory is how we ensure that the lessons purchased with blood are not forgotten when the generation that learned them dies. These men saved the world. That is not hyperbole. That is not melodrama. That is the simple truth. The soldiers who fought World War II, the famous ones and the forgotten ones, the generals and the sergeants, the infantry and the engineers, they saved the world from tyranny. They did it with courage and sacrifice and determination. They also did it with pliers and screwdrivers and practical mechanical knowledge applied in foxholes. The least we can do is remember their names. Raymond Kowalski, Detroit mechanic, 82nd Airborne Sergeant. The man who fixed the M1 Carbine magazine spring in 11 minutes while Winchester took 7 years. His story deserves to be told. His innovation deserves to be remembered. His example deserves to be followed. Trust the people using the equipment. Listen when they say something is wrong. Act before more people die. That is the lesson. That is what Raymond Kowalski taught us. That is why his story still matters 80 years later. Remember his name. Up next we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.